Welcome back, everybody, to the Wrestling Card Collector series on WTCtv. We've covered a lot of topics over the last couple of years on these shows and on other shows in and around the hobby, but one of the areas that we haven't gone and really done a deep dive on is vintage. And when I mean vintage, I mean going way back to day one, early tobacco cards, the 20s, what's known as the pre-war era. I think, Tony, you'd agree, probably one of the reasons why we haven't done a lot of it is because there's not a lot of guys we can talk to about it,
Not too many people out there that
No,
have
not too many people
any
know that.
level of expertise.
Yeah, that's a special collector that knows that stuff. But there
We
is
got one of those guys today. We got
we've
one of those
got
guys
we
today.
we might have the guy, the wrestling card king, Mr. Rob England, long overdue from being on the collector series. Rob, thanks for joining us. We're going to get into again your collecting history, all the work you've done in the hobby, the early days of PSA, and then I'd like to talk vintage because I like to tie these shows to a particular topic, and there's not a lot of information out there, particularly about the early stuff, the tobacco cards and all that stuff. So we're going to get into that with you. Thanks for joining us. Finally, we can sit face to face and chat about this stuff. Um, I know you've done this before in other shows, Rob, and just for the people that don't know who you are, tell us how you got started in the hobby, wrestling in general, because you're big into Olympic wrestling, obviously, as well. And then we'll get right into the vintage discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for having me on. And I know it took a while for our schedules to connect, but here
Just a
we
bit,
are,
yeah.
and we'll have a good conversation on vintage. But just overall, I've always been a collector. I remember just in my small little hometown of Blue Lake, California, about 1,000 people. In 1982, one of the Major League Baseball players that was in the World Series, Dane Orge at the time. And as a kid, that captivated my attention. Our local grocery store had their baseball cards up on a wall. And I remember we weren't looking for the stars at the time, as far as for Pete Rose, anything like that. We wanted to get the locals. And he actually had a brother, Garth, who was just up the street. And I remember trick-or-treating his house. And so, shoot, that's been 42 years now that I've been in the hobby in some way. And I would say a little bit faded, a little bit in the 90s at a typical time in high school, early college. But I've always had my finger, around it. So I didn't really take a full time out, but maybe not as hardcore. But back then, I remember getting 1983 Topps card of Dan Gable, who is one of my heroes as far as for an amateur wrestler. I remember the Impel with the Olympic series, which there was a million of those too, and buying some of those packs. And then one of my good buddies, he bought me the 1995 Grapple set that actually has Kurt Angle's first appearance on a card. And he gave that to me as a gift in 1996. And a few years later from there, I discovered eBay. And I remember my goal at the time is when I signed up for eBay, and this was January of 99, is that I was going to buy every single amateur wrestling card that I could find. And I didn't think it would be that hard. But then this is the early days of the internet too. And then discovering that Italy had a lot of stuff, Germany had stuff, and it just took me down this little rabbit hole. And again, I was kind of like you, Paul, in trying to get everything. And kind of what got me into pro wrestling as well is that in the early days, a lot of the pro wrestlers had real good amateur backgrounds. So, within the Parkhurst set, you would find someone like Vern Gagne, or I remember going to the NCAA championships and meeting Jack Briscoe, and he was an NCAA champion. And then the more I learned about these old vintage wrestlers, instead of buying their particular card, I just said, I'm going to get the set and I'll learn about them later. And so then I started collecting everything. And then even going back into the early 19th century, where those are legitimate competitions, right? And then where it starts getting murky is where pro wrestling as we know it, which I kind of think of the 20s basically, of where there's, throne matches, but they had a lot of skill too. And so with that, I just decided that I was gonna base my collection more so like a museum and try to go back as far as I could go back and, and go from there.
Now, you're very active, Rob, in the early days with the PSA registrations, and you paved the way for a lot of those sets to be added. What got you into that? Because as you know, Tony, you've done some of it. I've never graded cards, and that's a lot of what your collection and a lot of that sort of territory that you broke for the hobby. What got you into that?
I was resistant for a long time. Of course, PSA had been around for at least 15 years. And I myself probably had the same feeling as many others. Like, why would I want to have my money when I could buy more cards? I'll buy more cards instead of, paying for this grading. And this is really like a labor of love for me too. And the cards were pretty cheap. But I think at some point, it just added another level of collecting. So you could have 3 Lou Thez #1 cards from 1954 Parkhurst, but one could be a 2, one could be a 4, one could be a 6. And then just adding to a level of quality within my collection. And I decided that, this was a step for me to take, and I kind of dipped my toes into it. And it's actually added a level of excitement for me in being able to upgrade my collection, because if it was just about having the cards, I probably would have stopped at some point, because in essence, I kind of had most of the things that were out there that I collect.
Yeah, I kind of put the brakes on. I didn't take that extra step. For me, it was like, well, I'm gonna hang on to these. I don't want to flip them, you know. Once I have a card, yeah, I want it to be as good as condition I can. But that's a great notion about how can you verify that this is a better version of that card. Now, how was it in the early days with the registry with PSA when a lot of this stuff hadn't been archived or they didn't have any record of it? Because we know
Um,
now, right, Tony?
Yeah, big difference now.
Yeah.
yes. So, well, initially I submitted a lot of the sets that were well known. I would say Parkhurst, my very first submission. I remember looking and at the 82 Wrestling All-Stars Hulk Hogan and thinking, this is the very first card of Hulk Hogan. That would be a good card to submit. And on my very first submission, I sent that in and it came back a PSA 9.
Wow.
And in retrospect, right, that is
Yeah.
amazing. But there was some kind of thought process for me to think that that would be a good idea. Now, my bad idea was flipping that card for $135,
Jesus.
Jesus. Wow.
thinking, at the time, 82A sealed sets were like $60, right? So that could buy 2 sets, at the time. And so it actually added a level to be able to pay for my submissions. For the most part, I may grade multiple copies of one card and keep the highest one and just sell off the others and give myself multiple chances to get high grades. But, sometimes people are willing to pay a price, and I'll flip things here and there just
You've been active
keep my hobby
throughout.
going.
You've been active throughout moving this stuff around. Like you're well known that you do sell your stuff and you sort of level up. Like I never sell anything,
Absolutely,
right?
but it's kind of funny how people consider me a seller, but I think if they really knew what I had, that's just
Relative to, yeah.
that's just cleaning some stuff up.
Mhm.
As far as, at some point it gets a little overwhelming. The one thing is when you slab cards, it takes up a lot of space than being in card savers or boxes. And it's one of my appeals of collecting cards more so than figures, etc., that I could have it confined to one room in my house. But yeah, I don't need, let's say 10 1991 classic Undertakers and PSA 8. Like, I don't need that.
Hey, you guys want to start talking some vintage? Go way back?
How far back we going?
I'm gonna go right back to the very,
Mhm.
very beginning, Tony.
Go
Rob,
for it.
let's talk vintage. Let's sort of go back and sort of come this way towards modern day. And what I want to do is just throw out some names of cards and have you chat about them and what's special about them and what you know about them. And obviously, when we start talking about the earliest of the early, we start with the 1980, sorry, 19, the 1887 Allen and Ginter. And these are all part of what we call tobacco cards, which were kind of like what Leaf does today, multi sets of different people that included wrestlers. So the very first one has the classic Theo Bauer and the William Muldoon and the Edwin Bibby cards. What were those all about? Talk to us about what they look like, how they were packaged, and all that stuff.
Yeah, so of course they were an insert into tobacco products. Some of the modern Allen and Ginter releases kind of mimic those as well. I like the plain, of course, they're like art. And for what people really don't know, even though they're 137 years old, the 1887s, I wouldn't even consider those rare cards. You could go onto eBay, and I'm sure you could complete a set of wrestlers, not too difficult, right? Now, the condition, that's where the difficulty lies. And at one point, I just had what I would call set fillers, but then eventually kind of, got my quality up where I have all 7 wrestlers. I have 5 in PSA 7, which is near mint, and then 2 in PSA 8s, which is pretty incredible for a 137-year-old card at this point. Someone like William Muldoon, he's in the Hall of Fame for boxing and wrestling. He was a commissioner in New York for many, many years as well. He's one of the guys I really like. He's in the Goodwin set as well in the 1888 range. And then he's also in the 1889 SF Hess. And for 19th century cards, the SF Hess are the rarest of the rare. There's not a known checklist complete. There are some cards that only one is known to exist. And I have a William Muldoon. And so something like that to me is just really priceless because you will I will never say never, right? Not in this world.
It's wrestling.
But find a replacement. Good luck. You'll need it.
Here's a question for both you guys. We know that these were not only sports, just like you could get all sorts of actors and people. How popular do you think the wrestlers were relative to other inserts in those tobacco cards? Like if you're a kid, if you're someone hoping to get one of those cards, what do you think you wanted to pull? Who on the day would have been the most attractive pull in those cards, do you figure?
Well, there were baseball players, so
And there were
I
political
think they would
figures?
have high appeal. Of course, John L. Sullivan, I think, would have appeal as well. But wrestling at that time was really barnstorming around, like in circuses and from town to town. And I think it had a level of popularity that we may be dismissive now today. But back then, it really was extremely popular when they came through to a town, especially if you had this very talented wrestler who is willing to take on all comers within that town. That's going to bring the town folk out if you have someone that's known to be a badass in town, but this guy's traveling through, and how would he rank against this guy?
Yeah.
That leads me to like 2 names that become popular probably a decade later, Gotch and Hackenschmidt. And they were in the Ogdens, I believe, the 1908s. But I wanted to talk specifically about the 1912 Max Rigot postcards. And I did a little bit of background information, and it turns out that this Max Rigot guy was the printer of postcards on the time for like the Chicago World Fair, and he did stuff with like linens and stuff. So he was the guy that did that kind of product. And we know about the series of postcards that he put out that featured the match from Comiskey Park. And I know, Rob, you're an expert historian on those. Talk about those postcards and about the event itself.
So yes, just searching eBay back in the day, I noticed that these postcards were numbered, which gave me a clue that they were a part of a set. And I've been a daily eBay browser for items for 25 years now. And so I was piecing together that set, and eventually all 16 came to light, and all 16 became a part of my collection. So the actual postcards that you see of Gotch and Hackenschmidt, I think they're labeled 1912, and that's probably my own doing. But they were actually released in 1911, and those images of them wrestling were from their 1908 match, and they're training for their 1911 match in Comiskey Park. And just to think about this match in Comiskey, Labor Day weekend, 30,000 people there to see this big match, a rematch from 3 years prior. This American who beat, George Hackenschmidt, which he looks like Brock Lesnar in 1900. So imagine what a freak and a specimen. And here this, Iowa farm boy goes, head to head with him. Now there are some stories about, Gotch greasing himself and, where he'd be slippery to hold on to. And Hackenschmidt had this knee injury, and maybe Gotch had planted someone to go into Hack's camp and hurt his knee before their rematch. So there's just this, who knows the element of truth, right? But some of these stories that happen, but many people have said that that's really the birth of not only pro wrestling within this country, but also amateur wrestling. And anyone that knows amateur wrestling knows that Iowa is a hotbed for amateur wrestling. And a lot of that could be attributed to Frank Gotch and his, popular run where he was, undefeated from 1908 through 1913. Just incredible.
What was the attendance on that, Rob? How many people?
30,000 people. And I actually have a ticket stub from that match, and it's the only one that I've ever seen. And just due to the historic nature of that event, that is one of my prized items for sure.
Yeah, like think about it. 30,000 people back then. So, the wrestling's had its ups and downs, but there was a time where that many people cared to go out and, memorabilia was made of the event. So that's pretty cool.
It's incredible when you think about it. And that's where I say, I think people underestimate the popularity of wrestling in the early years, because that's proof of it.
Yeah, and we don't have a boatload of collectibles. I mean, everyone's going to remember what happened in wrestling in 2022, but to go back and find stuff from back then, commemorating the biggest night in wrestling probably for years on both sides of that event, that's really something. One other thing,
And I don't think wrestling has done a great job of promoting its history. And I know here recently that we're talking about, WWE and finding these collectibles, but most of these collectibles are from recent decades. But, if there was, and of course, there's some Hall of Fames. There's a Hall of Fame in Iowa. There's one that went from New York to Texas and back to New York. And of course, a lot of challenges with that Hall of Fame. But I don't think pro wrestling in particular has done a real good job about sharing its history.
Why do you think that is?
I really don't know, to have that disconnect with it. I really do believe that the museum in Iowa is doing a really good job and has a real good foundation of putting on a quality event and is financially stable. And I think some of that just has to do with the people in charge there in Waterloo. I do know that Mike Chapman has been really adamant about promoting the history of wrestling. He's a big Gotch guy. He's from Iowa. And that's part of my love of, vintage, as well as Frank Gotch and how he was basically the first superstar of pro wrestling and also inspired many amateur wrestlers as well.
You're quite
It's sad
active.
that it's sad that we have, such rich history in wrestling going back to those times, and there's not enough people out there who want to archive that information across all. It becomes lost in time, and so we have guys like you, Rob, that go out there and preserve that information out there, and your collection is proof of these existence of things that happened out there, and how important it is to the general overall sport itself. And it's nice to know that there's somebody out there with this Hall of Fame that's trying to archive information. It's really cool.
Yeah, if you don't do
Yeah,
it,
and part of my collection too was trying to get all of the world champions from back in the day. So, getting a collectible of Farmer Burns, getting a collectible of William Muldoon, getting a collectible of Gotch, Hackenschmidt, Joe Stecker, Earl Caddock, Strangler Lewis, Wayne Munn, Jim Lundos, and just going through and making sure, because I had to have everything, but just making sure to have a collectible of those guys.
these names you just mentioned, almost all of them turn up in the exhibit postcards in both series, the ones that came out in the 30s and the ones that came out in the 50s, where the names like Strangler Lewis and Jim Londos were the biggest names of the day. Those two sets are interesting to me because there was like a gap in between them, but they pretty much covered everybody, like especially the ones that came out in the 50s. Like Vern's in that set, Bruno's in that set. Um, the Farmer, that's a Don Eagle, that's really hard to find. Talk about those sets, Rob. Like you see them often enough, but the earlier sets really hard to come by.
Yes. So the 1930 exhibit, and I'll just say it right now, is that I don't have a complete set of it. And that's how challenging that set is to put together. And if I'm able to, I have 90-something% of it, but I'm still missing some. And I've been searching for at least 15 years, 20 years with that. And it has Bronco Nagurski as a wrestler.
Canadian.
Yes. World champion wrestler, of course, a Hall of Fame football player as well. We did see an exhibit of Bronco sell this last year for 5 figures. Isn't that correct?
Wow.
And deservedly so, because that card is extremely rare. I've also seen one of those Broncos that's actually signed, that's
Wow.
in a
Oh.
collection, which is incredible when you think about the National Chickle football card, which is like the pinnacle football card in the hobby. And just knowing that Bronco has another card from that decade, that's a phenomenal collectible. I would say a 5-figure price for that wrestling exhibit is a good price.
Well, think
But
about it. Outside of
they're
books,
the rarest of the rare. Those 30s exhibit, the 50s, you could find those pretty cheap. But again, it really captures the stars of a lot of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s.
I don't have a Vern, and I mentioned a Don Eagle. I don't have one of him, and they've come up. They've just been expensive. But I was just going to say, outside of books, right? You have no records of these guys. So how do you learn these names? We know Vern Gagne because obviously in later life he became AWA, but a lot of these names like Londos and Theobald Bauer and all these kinds of guys, people don't know. So it's these cards that really perpetuate, like you say, the legacy of all this stuff. So that's why we don't chat about this stuff a lot because there's just not a lot of record to go to. We're not being bombarded by these names all the time. But what
You
other
got
names?
to read books, Paul, and the
Yeah.
collectors out there need to read books. I
Well,
know that
I read a book once it was done about the NWA. It was a real thick book. And it was so much stuff in there that I'd never heard of and names I'd never known, not only in the ring, but behind the scenes. And it's like, being a wrestling card collector, I think it's too bad we didn't have more of this stuff. Not that the postcards weren't enough, but they're really compared to what we get today, for example, or even since the 80s, since the All Stars broke and that whole era started. A lot of this pre-war stuff, or what we call vintage in the hobby, there's just not a ton of it out there. And there's not a lot of guys collecting it. I remember when I went to the National in 2010, that's what I saw. I saw old stuff. I didn't see anything new at that point. It's not like now, Tony, that we go and
Mhm.
everyone's got all the latest Panini in the upper deck and stuff.
There was nothing like that. I went in 02, 03, whatever it was in Anaheim, California. At that time, I was working with Lori Petty at the time, and yeah, I don't recall any. There was nothing modern. It was all vintage stuff.
Yeah, I went to the National in 2009, 2010 when it was in Baltimore,
Yeah, I went
and
to the one in
specifically
2010.
went to tables and looking. And I brought some stuff, my stuff that I had dupes and stuff of, and tried to upgrade, and I was able to make some trades. But basically, the only things that I was finding were the Allen and Ginters, Goodwins, stuff like that. There was never any wrestling all stars or
Mm-mm.
no Parkhurst, nothing. It was basically 19th century stuff that people would put out, as part of their table.
And, at that show at 2010 is where I bought my 5 ringside boxing cards, and I'd never seen them before. And I remember the seller just had the 5 wrestlers, and I marked them down because I remember, yeah, it's Deus Ex, Stanley, Gene Stanley, who was a big name, Argentina Rocco, Ilya DePaula, and Don Eagle again. And that was one of my memories. I was there hawking the price guide, Tony, if you during that time. But I
Yeah.
remember coming back with those 5 ringside cards. And I particularly like those because obviously we had the Parkhurst, but those came sooner. And they were the first sort of color cards of wrestlers. And again, that was a boxing set, but it was just a wrestling subset of those guys.
And they had the biography on the back as well, which
Correct.
of course we could learn a little bit about the wrestlers by reading the backs, which is a limitation of the exhibits because
Was
they're
that
blank back.
that was tops too, wasn't it, Rob?
Yes.
Yeah. And before that,
You may have bought those off Gary, the boxing collector, Gary Schultz out of Illinois.
Yeah,
that's
we saw him the last 2 years too.
you remember that name, Tony? I don't.
Yeah, and I believe we even didn't we not even interview the guy?
Gary?
I thought we did.
Yeah,
I
maybe.
could
I just
swear
don't
we
recall.
did.
Yeah, maybe. I just don't
Yeah,
recall. I
yeah,
don't recall in 2010 who I bought them from.
yeah. He
So
had
Gary
impressed.
used to delve into wrestling a little bit, and I would put up what I felt like was a nice high bid, and I needed this item. And I would look, and it was Gary at ashd.com. And I was just like, throw up my hands. And I don't know how many times that guy took me out, but I actually made some trades with him too. So
Well, I remember when we went a couple of years ago and I was talking to guys on the floor. And I think I mentioned this to you when I came back that I'd say, "Oh, I'm into wrestling." "Oh, do you know the King?" I guess from the registries, or your name came up a few times, like from guys in the real world. A lot of times we're all insulated in social media, but guys in the real world, I guess because you'd paved the way for a lot of that stuff, or you were active with a lot of these guys, especially on the older stuff. They knew who you were, that's for sure.
yeah, I know I had contacted PSA at one time, and the lady on the other line, she was just like, "Oh, this is you." And I'm like, "Yeah." And she goes, "I always knew your submissions, or if I did research and stuff," because she said you would send in stuff like interesting, of course, like Parkhurst or wrestling stuff that they would have to look and as far as to make sure the labels were right. And she goes, "It was such a break." She goes, "I got tired of seeing Mike Trout. And when you sent stuff," she goes, "it was just something different." So just the nature of my submissions definitely caught her eye. And I think for some collectors too, that many wrestling cards were not in slabs. And so, and that's a section of the hobby that they don't buy cards unless they're slabbed. And so getting some of those circulated as well, I like to think that that played a part in just the expansion of wrestling cards in general to some people that otherwise wouldn't be interested. And I think it legitimized them.
Absolutely. Before we move on, Rob, I want to mention 1948 magic photos. You know, the ones that you rub down and then they appear. Did you ever get
Yes.
those?
So this is the Topps issue. It's actually Topps first issue from 1948, and different sports, and wrestling is a subset of 25.
Yeah.
And so basically it's a blank image, and you were to apply moisture, which it could be from water, perhaps spit, and then to have this you know, developed through the, through the sun to create a photo. So what's really interesting about these is that you could have a really good conditioned card, but it could be underdeveloped. And
Right.
so you could
Not
have
dark
a
enough.
7, but the image is faint, or you could have a really developed photo and you could have like a little crease and it's a 3. So again, you could have a 6 and a 6, but this has good photo development. So I'm going to take this one. I'll sell this one. And again, it captures, many of the legends of wrestling through the first, 50 years of the 1900s. And there was a clue on the back. So it could say something about, US's first world champion. And then when the image develops, you'll see Frank Gotch, right? One of the cool things that I found, and this was only within the last year, 18 months. And again, I've been looking at this stuff for decades, but the cropping on the Gotch photo, where it was almost full body instead of just the waist up. And I initially had always collected the waist up ones, and I've seen probably hundreds of those, but I have like this full body image of Gotch now from that set.
Nice.
So
Like a variant? Is a variant?
it's a variant.
Nice. Yeah,
And the Gotch
we
is my
saw some of
guy.
those
So
we saw
I
some
was
of those
just
last
super
year.
excited to find that.
Yeah.
And have you ever seen the album, Rob, that they come in? I mean, it's
I
meant for the
have.
entire set of them, but
Yeah. And again, I have to have limits on things, so I just stick with the wrestling. But then also the numbering on the back is either vertical or horizontal, and one of them is harder to collect than others. And I don't even have all 25 of one of the versions, and I've been really passive about completing the set with how the numbering is on the back.
I haven't
But
managed either. I tried to buy a complete set once that were mint, but we just couldn't strike a deal. And it's what you mentioned, the consistency. Sometimes they're a real nice brown and the contrast is really good, but sometimes they're very faded and sometimes they're actually too dark. So to find a complete set with all of them not torn to rat shit that, look good is tough. That's why I mentioned them. But it's an interesting collectible because it's not technically a card, but it's made by Topps and it's like all the rest of the stuff. It's a subset of wrestlers and it's all we got. It's the only thing you can hold in your hand that say, here's such and such from back in the day.
I
What
would say it's a card. It's just a small card.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. What about the name Al Haft and those calendar cards? What's the story with those? That's 52 to 54.
Yeah, so I actually haven't completed all the 53s and 54s. And I think those were based out of Ohio, Midwest region. And it was a little bit difficult with those as well. The 52s are pretty clear. They're more black and white. And the others are more sepia, but then there's a little bit of crossover where the same image from 53 can be found in 54. So how do you say what goes in 53, what goes in 54 if two cards are the exact same, right? So that's the challenge with the 53s, 54s. 52s are really cut and dry. They're black and white. They have little naturally rounded corners, but it's a pretty amazing set. And having Lou Thez, Vern Gagne as well. There's Don Eagle. Actually, that set, actually, I have a few PSA 10s from the 52 Al Haft, which is pretty incredible for a 60-something-year-old wrestling card to be a
Who
mint.
exactly was Al Haft? Is he like a Boyd Pierce? He was just a dude on the scene at the time organizing stuff, or was he a promoter? Or,
I believe promoter in
yeah,
the Midwest region. Yes.
I see. And they say calendar cards. So what was the connection to the calendar?
So they did have a calendar with those images. And so you could actually take, if you found that calendar, and in essence make a hand cut set, but you would be able to tell the difference between the calendar cards than the actual cards that were produced. Well, I can at least. But yeah, so they can be found on the calendar.
And then the last set I sort of figured we chat about is the ones that sort of get us to the end of the era, which is the ones made up here. Leave it to the Canadians to get it right. The 55, 56 Parkhursts, which made up here in Canada, were a massive set, like what was it, 120 in the second run and 80 or something like that in the first. I don't recall. And they were the first.
75 in the first, right?
Is that what it was, Tony? Yeah.
75 in the first run,
And
and
how
then
many?
they had
121 in the second.
121 in the second.
And
The
they were full
54.
color, and you can find these. I'm sure, Rob, you have a pristine. I don't. There used to be a guy around town that used to collect the parkies, as he called them, and he'd always be leveling up. So when he'd get a better version, I get his shittier version, and that's sort of what's made the bulk of my complete set of those. But I saw once at the Sport Expo here in Toronto many years ago, an absolutely mint set of those. And the guy wanted $500, which was a lot of money back then for anything to do with wrestling cards or anything like that. Um, but they were beautiful. And I remember coming back and looking at my beat up ones that had probably passed through many hands. Um, what does your set look like? I'm sure you've got stuff in a very high grade across the board on those.
So I have the highest graded Parker sets from 54, 1, 2, and 3. So that's my main one. I actually kind of collaborated with another collector where if he needed a 55, 56 and he had a 54, we would trade back and forth. So my 54 set got better and his 55 got better. And I should have bought him out. And I think we're negotiating on price a little bit, and he ended up selling it to another person, but I helped build that best set. And I'm sitting number 3 in the 55 set right now. But those cards are an extreme challenge in good condition. And I would even go as far as to say a PSA 5 for a Parkhurst is a pretty nice card. A PSA 6 is a really nice card.
So that's as good as they get.
7s, 8s, there's only a few 9s. I used to joke that I used to believe that they were like made in a cement mixer or something. I just couldn't understand why so many of these cards were beat up.
I've seen a Grail set. I know why. It's, Frenchman up here, Quebec. I've seen that Grail set. Like I say, I saw this at a show and I couldn't believe they looked like they were freshly printed and they were just gorgeous. And I should have bought them and I didn't. But
that would be a steal, I'm telling you, because
Yeah.
9s, 8s, 7s, you're going to get real good price.
Sure. Oh yeah,
In
sure.
reality, I wouldn't sell a 7 below a
It's
couple
funny. Tony and I
$100
talk
because you
about this.
can't find them.
Back then, I never connected wrestling cards to money in the future. Yeah, I just didn't. It was just, like you, I enjoyed the stuff. I collected it. It was fun to look at. That's where it kind of ended. I never had this foresight that, you and David had to think, oh, if we legitimate the value of these by grading them, et cetera, and the value goes up, the markets go up and things like that. But even back then, it was like, oh, these are beautiful, but I have a set already. That mindset that I shouldn't try and get the best set possible for me, it was like, no, why would I buy this set again? I can buy another set. You know what I mean? Kind of what you said earlier, Rob, about having so many classic Undertakers. You only need 1 or 2 10s and been there, done that kind of thing.
Yeah, what I would say with the Parkhurst set, but after buying many sets on eBay, one of the things that I was always wondering about was why wouldn't I see, like, how are these distributed? And why wouldn't I see wrappers of these things? You would think I would see a wrapper
You saw
for
the
these.
wrappers. We've,
I
we've
eventually did,
yeah, I saw
but
that too.
it took a long time for it to be shown.
When you posted it, that's what I remembered. And this was the same guy,
Well,
Wayne, back in the
it took me
day.
many years to find that wrapper.
Yeah, but that was around, obviously, because I remember once you posted it, I definitely seen it before. And again, going back to this guy in around 2000, right? That was leveling up. He had one, and as soon as I saw the image, I remembered, like, yeah, but yeah, they're just not out there. Now, tell me about the ones. I don't know if we've talked about this before. The ones that are blacked out on the back. Have you seen those?
Oh, yes. And I honestly don't know too much about them. They were
Test print, maybe?
something, or I think they're even afterwards. So it's kind of a little bit odd, those cards. I don't even think I could speak to them too well. I've seen them. I don't even own any, but there was a handful that were on eBay for a while. I haven't seen a complete checklist of those.
Well, I'm not sure if they're legit. Like, if you don't know them, I haven't seen them. Tony, I trust you haven't seen these things.
I've seen one, and it
Have
made
you?
me think of like the junk wax era stuff that Tops used to black out their boxes to signify that they're junk wax is discounted out the door. It almost seems like with all the different kind of offers these Parkhurst cards had on the back of them, that it's like, well, just black it out because that's not available anymore, kind of thing. And it almost seemed like that to me, but I don't really know.
Well, this was the 50s, so it's like,
Yeah.
we have to go way back to find out, but I've seen them. I've seen them in person. I've not seen them anywhere online, or else I'd be trying to put an image together to share. But I've definitely,
There were some on eBay at one point.
that's where you saw them. See, they're
Yes.
like 95 paninis. They're just really rare. They're out there, but they're hard to pick up,
One of the things I would say about the Parker set is by looking at that wrapper, there was only 4 cards per pack.
Is that right?
And so 2 of those cards likely got damaged in the package by the wax, either through like gum or the wax on the back. So I think that that's also one of the reasons. And I don't think there that many produced in relation to, of course, hockey or anything like that. And so if half of them are being damaged from the get, how many of them are actually going to survive and be pristine? I do believe that the 55, 56 set is a little bit easier to find and higher grade than the 54, 55.
Well, they're floating around up here. I mean, obviously, as decades go on, they're drying up, but I've seen them up here, like when not recently, but that one min set that comes to mind and subsequent shows. I always go to the sports show in Mississauga because it's not far. And just, for years and years, just laughing, maybe one day I'll see a wrestling card here. And they do turn up, not often in sets, but people have them, and particularly in Quebec. So, one day I'd like to go driving in North Quebec and see. I'm sure there's floating around some stuff there.
One of my best stories about collecting the Parker sets is that I used to just buy them and just try to get as many upgrades within the set as possible and put that in my set. And I was thumbing through and looking at the fronts and the backs. And one of the things that we didn't mention was the 54 set has lucky premium backs for the prizes. And so that, in essence, that master set is 137 cards if you
Some
try to
don't
collect
have the
the lucky
advert on the back.
premiums or
Right.
the bio backs, right?
Right.
So I'm always looking at the backs. And so I bought this set, and I would say, just guessing, I probably paid between 75 to 150 for the set at the time. But I look at the back and I look, and I've seen his autograph before, and I was like, no way. I go, this is Bobo Brazil's autograph on a 1954 Parkhurst. And wrestling autographs are mostly found on programs, and I think even in the 2000s, 90s, like a lot of 8x10 collectors and stuff. But wrestling card autographs on cards is, I consider it more of a recent phenomenon. And to find a Bobo Brazil on a Parkhurst, I thought was just incredible. And I sent it to PSA DNA. I got that slabbed. I will say that I've been at this a while. I was able to get a Lou Thez to sign his number 154 card. I went to the NCAAs and Vern Gagne was there. He signed a 54 for me as well. At the time, George Scott was alive and he lived at Indian Rocks Beach in Florida. He signed his 54 and 55 for me, and 55 by Don Leo Jonathan. And I know there's a few Killer Kowalskis as well, but there's not very many, wrestling cards from, 50s, 60s that are signed,
That's
period.
very cool.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the all-stars and guys like trying to get those all signed, find those over the years, but I don't think enough is talked about those Parkhurst cards. And can you imagine someone trying to complete a set of those things signed? That'd be incredible.
Yeah, just to find 10 of them, you would be doing some amazing work.
Well, just to find one, I'd be like, I'm done. This is great. This is great.
Yeah, it's really one.
Yeah.
Well, it's a testament, Rob, to your sort of love and what you've done to sort of go back and learn about all these cards and put these sets together and get them graded and learn about them and share that knowledge. Any other sets that come to mind that we haven't talked about, sort of up to the Parkhurst of significance? We talked about tobacco. We talked about Rigot, supply postcards. Anything else come to mind?
Well, of course, the wrestlers were in the 1908, 1909 Ogdens, and you touched on those a little bit.
Those were tobacco, though, weren't they?
Yeah. But another one that I would say is the Sompertex set.
The British ones.
The TV, yeah, the British ones.
Yeah.
But interesting one is a General Adnan rookie in that set when he was under a different name, Chief Billy White Wolf, right? And so that's the hard thing about wrestling and having different characters. So when I went to the gathering in 2019, I brought some of my Chief Billy White Wolf cards and had him sign a few of those, and thinking how many people, again, it's kind of like you have to know your history to have him sign his rookie card from the 60s, when probably a lot of people thought that his first appearance was on the Wrestling All-Stars in 1983.
You were the only one, Rob. No one else no one else came with that card ever. Or subsequently.
Probably not. But I'm just pretty fanatic about this stuff, and there's always something to learn.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, let's talk about Olympic wrestling and the cards there. That's not something that's talked about either in our hobby much. It's all professional wrestling pretty much. And I know that you're an aficionado of the Olympic cards as well. Give us a sort of quick rundown of what's happened in that world and what some of the big cards. I mean, obviously the Gable cards are going to be the biggest, but talk about that stuff.
Yeah, it's really my first love. And I've collected tickets from the Olympics 1928 all the way through, well, in Tokyo, there wasn't tickets with COVID and all of that. So I have all the tickets, and I have them all slabbed by PSA. I would just say the Kurt Angle, the 1998 Culture House, is an amazing card. And I think many people feel that is his rookie, but he was also part of the game card from Grapple in 1995 as well. And I know that people are aware of that. But then also within the Grapple set is an insert, and where it's like a bonus points. So an insert card and some packs. And that was distributed by Team USA. And I've only seen a few of those Kurt Angles, and I have one in my collection. I know my buddy in Iowa has one, and there was one on eBay up until I think about 2 weeks ago, and it sold for $600 raw. And I would say that's a pretty good deal for a Kurt Angle card, where I think there's less than 10 of them. So I've asked
him many times. I said, "Could you check your drawers anywhere in a box? Do you have anything like this?"
Do you have any?
I don't have any, man.
Do you have any of Kurt's Olympic stuff, Tony?
No, I have a black a card that a customer brought to the store and thought that I'd be interested in it, and I took it, of course. It came with his commemorative ticket to his high school graduation. And it also came with a black and white trading card of him. It's a black and white headshot of
Oh,
him. I had to
Pennsylvania
just
Legends card,
possibly,
right
yeah,
after the Olympics.
yeah.
So that was
So
a state release by someone that's really involved with high school wrestling in the state. And after he won the Olympics, they actually had quite a few series, and I was buying all those up too. And so I've had some of those Kurt black and white cards, but I'm sure the
yeah,
production run on that is pretty low too.
I enjoyed it. I took a picture of it. I sent it over to him, and he's like I haven't seen that in a while.
But you recognized it?
Oh, he recognized it, yeah, because this guy was fanatical with what he brought in for when we had Kurt in the store. I mean, he actually has he brought an actual Olympic torch from that year. It's like that he had that was used in the Las Vegas Strip run
Oh, a real
for
torch.
that year, a real torch.
Wow.
He brought that in, and he brought in a couple copies of his high school yearbook. Um,
Wow.
it just weird stuff. He just brought me the other day. He came in the other day. He brought in a whole bunch of stuff. He got he's like, man, I wish I would have found this stuff in my storage unit before you had Jimmy Hart in here. He had Jimmy Hart's termination letter from WCW, residual checks from his book. All this cool stuff. Like this guy just finds that obscure stuff. So like I'm gonna be friends with you going forward, I think.
Good guy to know.
Yeah.
I watched Kurt win his world title in 1995 in Atlanta. And last year, when I went back to the gathering and he was there on the last day, I actually had a T-shirt that my buddy who went there outgrew, and he had given it to me, and I had Kurt sign that. And I think when he sees his amateur stuff, I think it really stops. And
Yeah, he pops pretty well for that kind of stuff. It's there are not many people out there like you, Rob, that bring stuff like that to guys like him, and he does pop pretty well for that. And just like, wow, you don't see this very often, man. You must be a real fan of the sport.
yes, I've noticed that with Kurt. And one of his heroes is Dave Schultz. So if you know anything about Foxcatcher and the tragedy of
Yes.
DuPont murdering Dave, and yeah,
That's a crazy story, by the way.
it is. I actually have a John DuPont autograph on a postcard because
Yeah, he was quite the
nutty on that stuff too.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Rob, how is the market for these amateur cards? Because again, we don't talk about them much. Like, do they get traded? Do they get sort of their respect? And
I'm
other
very
than
happy where
conversation
this
right now, has
market is
anybody ever
going,
talked about one
because
before?
as much as I have in the pro wrestling world, my amateur stuff is, I would say, off the chain as far as the quantities that I have.
So there's a lot of it.
Oh, I have tons. And what I would say is there, and I would say this pretty much developed during the COVID years, where some of the folks in the amateur wrestling world are getting into collectibles. And I have to say, I'm loving it, because I've got a lot of stuff that I've never graded that's just part of my collection. And there could be some really strong prices during COVID, which is a whole different time as far as pricing goes. I think I sold that Kurt Angle 8, like $1,500. It's probably half that now, right? Or a little less, but strong price. There's some markets for like Alexander Karelin, this freak of nature Russian, multiple Olympic champ. I think we're really trending upward in the amateur world, for sure. And of course, when you get crossover between amateur and pro, it adds another element for collectability with someone like Kurt.
The whole world out there. It's like Japanese sumo cards. I had no idea there was so many sets as there were. Like, I know there's a ton of Japanese that Tony's been archiving forever, but I had no idea. Like, we don't touch sumo, we don't touch MMA, obviously, we don't touch amateur. But I had no idea how much of the shit is out there, especially on the Japanese sumo side. Like hundreds of sets of these things. I was like,
But
wow.
you could get a Haku rookie if you collected sumo cards.
That's the thing. Who knows who turns up where, right?
Yeah, I don't know if there's like an earthquake
Nah, that'd be
sumo.
an interesting one. Well, it's funny because he was on that dark side, And I was looking through my collection to see if I had a Earthquake or a Tenta or even an Uncle Fred, a Tugboat or Typhoon Auto, and I didn't. And I thought to myself, they probably didn't sign a ton of that stuff.
No, his autograph goes for good money if you could find one on a
Right.
card.
Anyways, Rob, we could be talking all night about this stuff. This was great, sort of going down, doing a deep dive into vintage and sort of picking your brain and getting at some of this knowledge. Anything else, Tony, for Rob before we wrap up?
No, I just got to pick his brain some more and get some of these checklists completed at some point, man.
Yeah, well, we need to get those 1974 Mancos,
Yeah, the Mancos
Yeah.
are still
Andre the
outstanding.
Giant.
So
Get
not only having a checklist, but any bit of information, because when we're all gone from this planet, there's got to be some information about this for the future collectors. That's just the way it is. It's got to be that way. And if it wasn't for the price guides, for the Rob Englands, for WTC stuff, I mean, it gets lost in time, and we got to get this stuff put on paper someplace, so that people can learn about this stuff. Because I mean, inside that dome of yours on your shoulders there, sir, there's a lot of information that we need to get out and help collectors.
now. I just need to be diligent and just making sure that this happens. Just as far as the gongs with the flare from 1980, that's a really great thing to put on there. And it's a small set of 20,
Yeah,
collectible bromides. And
We
those
try and be as complete as
Mancos.
possible, and we get a lot of help and a lot of
we
love from the
do.
community. And
We do.
you, sir, for the older stuff, for the stuff like these gongs and these Japanese, where you've been on the scene, as long as we have, learning about them and figuring them out. We appreciate as much information as you can give to us in the community so we can share it. It's great.
Yeah, because the community's changed over the years. I mean, there wasn't a lot of Robs out there. There wasn't a lot of Pauls out there, and now in the last 5 to 10 years, more people have taken an interest in this stuff. We wouldn't have the updated stuff we have if it wasn't for Rich Veligan lately. It's like that with the Japanese stuff. I mean, he's really taken under his wing there to go and get as much information compiled as possible. His second book will be coming out this year, and some cross-referencing stuff like your site WTC, it's like that, and find like, oh, I forgot to put those in the book. Well, we have these and you don't have them in the book, and then vice versa. Obviously, filling in a lot of those gaps, it just helps a general collector over time. It just really does, and I'm so happy that we're in this era now. Wrestling's taken seriously, and that there's fun in it. There's investment purposes in it. So it's really nice to see that we're at this point right now. Long for many years, man, we all want to be taken seriously, and part of that is getting that information out there so people can be educated to like learn the history of this stuff, because they're all little, I'd say 2.5 by 3.5, but we know there's smaller ones and bigger ones of pieces of art, man.
Well, particularly some of these older sets, they really are pieces of art.
100%.
And the Mancos that we're missing, Rob, they are art.
Yep.
Mancos are just that, little pieces of art, more so than being a sports card with statistics. Anyway, guys, thanks very much. Rob, how can people find you out in the social world?
Just Google Wrestling Card King. I'm sure you'll see me on the PSA registry, Twitter, and
Man, if
people
you
have
don't know
questions.
if you don't know where to find Rob England these days, man, you're either really brand new and you don't know much, or you've just been hiding under a rock.
Some people just come into the hubby for a cup of coffee and off they go. So they,
Yeah.
it took us this long to get Rob on with us, so it's
Yeah, we've been bugging him since what, 19 something, I think, to get on the
as
show.
old as the Mancos.
But I'm glad to be here, be a part of it. I plan on being here for a long time. And yeah, it's good to see the community grow.
Awesome.
Yeah, agreed.
My name is Paul Anand. I'm here with my partner in crime, Tony Vela. Tony from WrestlingTradingCards.com, the place to go for every checklist imaginable. My site's called Wrestling Card Price Guide. Go there too every so often. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll be back at you again soon.